I'm really excited to be here today, everybody, to be talking about riding the tide of ethical investment, investing in the future of food. I think there are so many things that are happening right now in the food and beverage space that are tied into ethical investing. And it's really important first to understand what types of ethical investing we're talking about for those of you who may not be familiar with this portion of the world of finance. And so ethical investing means a few different things. You can talk about ESG investing, where you are investing more in the businesses who are also, you're checking financials for businesses, as well as investing in understanding what their backgrounds are and making sure they're environmentally and socially conscious. You can do socially responsible investing, where you are investing in making sure that they are also contributing positively to their social environment. And then impact investing, of course, where you're investing in companies which are driving impact and change on a more tangible level. And so ethical investments tend to mirror the political climate and social trends. And since the 1990s, ethical investments are really heavily focused on environmental issues. And one of the biggest issues that we're seeing is, different types of fuel impacting the environment, whether that's fossil fuels or whether that's food. Food is also another type of fuel. So it's really important to think of it that way. How are we going to make a difference in the way that we are consuming food and using food for fuel? And for ethical investing, it can mean quite a few different things besides capital investment. It can mean creating new businesses, it can mean entrepreneurship, or it can just mean consciously being aware of how you purchase. Your dollar matters. It is really important how you spend your dollar, how you invest your time in both your business and in your personal life. And so we have a really great panel today of people from different walks of the food and beverage universe. And so I want to start off by introducing all of our panelists today. And so I'll start first with Alex here. Please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about what you do at In-Flight Restaurants.
Well, thank you for having me, and very nice to sit here in front of this lively audience. My name is Alex Holt, and I'm the founder CEO of Flight's Restaurant Group. I'm actually here today just to make sure all of you come to my restaurant just down the street. All jokes aside, it's a very serious topic, and I think the future of foods, it's going to take a lot of people putting a lot of attention to these topics. But I am here today to chat with you guys and my lovely panel about everything that's going on in the space, and it's very exciting to be here in Vegas to do this together with you guys.
Thank you, Alex. All right, moving on. Jonathan Leahy, you're next. You're the Vice President at Laird Superfood. Take a moment and briefly introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about why you're here, your business, and how you're investing in more of an ethical food industry.
Well, I'm here because I'm a top 100 global food innovator. That's the first reason why, as many of you are, maybe all of you are. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you. More importantly, I'm the Vice President of Laird Superfood. Laird Superfood is a plant-based food company. We make everything from functional coffees to hydrates. We also have a line of nutritional bars, and we've been in business about 4 years, and we're facing this challenge of ethical investment because just 4.5 years ago, we were about 4 members, and now we have about 200 employees, and we're publicly traded on the New York Stock Exchange. And there's a growing need, of course, for alternative, sources of food, especially plant-based. And we've been at it for, quite some time, and we're sort of veterans in the business now because it's been taking off rapidly just in the past 12 to 16 months. So that's why I'm here. I'm here to explore opportunities and talk about, our ethical understanding of how we do business, and I think we'll explore that a little bit more in this panel discussion.
Thank you so much. Moving on, Jonathan Netsky. You are the CEO at Netsky by Local Alternative Foods. Tell us a little bit more about what you do and why it's so important to you.
Thank you. If you heard me speak this morning, you got a somewhat of an idea about how we operate. One of the things that somebody mentioned to me that was missed this morning is we put so much emphasis on the notion of how whole food really fits into an ethical food system. I didn't really give an example to clarify that everybody understood exactly what I meant by whole food. And so just to be clear, a lot of people love olive oil, especially extra virgin olive oil. But is it a whole food? No. The olive would be the whole food, right? And so that's what I'm talking about, is that fundamental difference in terms of how we source food, how we integrate food, as being truly from that primary source. And if we use blue corn from the Navajo reservation in a lot of our products, but it's a whole grain milled blue corn. So again, it's the whole food. And so from an ethical perspective, that's really where we founded the company, on the idea that it's baked in to every product we make and every decision we make as we process food. Today, from an investment standpoint, my company has been bootstrapped and funded by friends and family. We're at a stage now where we might be looking for, to move to a different type of scale and investment based on proof points. But ultimately, as we do, because of the whole food and the microbatching as were discussed, all of our sustainability principles grow with us. And so that's where we've invested our time to date in really understanding how to build a more ethical food system.
Thank you. And Benjamin, pleasure to meet you. You're the only one I didn't have a chance to meet beforehand, but thank you so much for being here. Benjamin Pasternak, President and CEO at Defiant Food Group and ORP. Love to hear more about your businesses, and please feel free to introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks for the intro. And listening to the panelists going forward, I really think that sustainability in the environment and really healthy, nutritious food is really a cradle to grave type thing. It's about having the right primary ingredient, but it's also about having a sustainable way to cook those products and allow those products to have the highest nutritional impact. So where I think we go wrong often is that we have great claims that we can make about that the product is organic, or that we've made it NAE, or we've adopted a claim about the primary product. But where I think we go incredibly wrong is that we then decide that we can manipulate those products in the processing to create more profits, and in turn reduce nutritional impact. And so at the end of the day, it's a cradle to grave approach that we need in the industry. And I think from an investment standpoint, we've seen a lot of alternative plant-based proteins come to market. We've seen a lot of great animal-based proteins come to market. And I think that if we can create a sustainable chain from birth to death of both a plant or an animal, and have the greatest impact to those that consume it, we're on the right path. And so I think the folks with the dollar signs are listening to that speech. And I think that at the end of the day, if we take a real clear, defined approach to the way that we change the industry, we're not only going to change food, but we're going to change the way that we consume as a capitalist nation. We have a different approach to the way that we approach the market. So sustainability and all these buzzwords are great, but at the end of the day, we really do have to modify who and what we are.
I agree with that 100%. And thank you so much for sharing that. And so hopefully it's later in the day and we've all had our coffee and everybody's awake. I just want to invite all the members of the panel as well to just contribute to anything else that you hear the other panelists say that speaks to you, and to just make this a more open discussion. And so this is a good segue into my first question. Benjamin, you work with some bigger agricultural companies, and Defiant Foods is based primarily on meat products, and now you're moving more into the plant-based space through ORP. What helped you to really make that decision to move and to offer more diversity and variety?
Yeah, I can answer it in a couple different ways. One, I feel pretty heavily that there's a lot of folks that say that everybody needs to move to a plant-based model. And at the end of the day, there are amino acids, and I'll dive into that a little bit on Thursday during my speech on the keynote, but there are amino acids that are not readily available in plant-based, that are not going to allow everybody to transfer to a plant-based model. So I've been on a lot of panels and discussed the idea of moving to a completely plant-based model, and if it works for you, if it works for your individual body, I think that's great. But if it doesn't work for you and you need animal-based, you need the most nutritional animal-based products that are made available to you. So that's important, I think, to some extent. I also think that what transferred us to go to a plant-based model was really ingredients. Our development team started to recognize significant changes in the available ingredients in the plant-based space, that when we took that and combined it with our knowledge of processing and our ability to produce, we found kind of a unique space in which, when we look out at the competitive field, both the big players, we've worked with all of the major Tysons and Purdue's and General Mills and Frito-Lay, and you kind of name it in that space. We saw a gap, and it's, I don't know if any of you read, it's not the big that eat the small, it's the fast that eat the slow. We knew that we had a position in that market, so we decided to eat their lunch.
Perfect. So that brings me to my next question. So many bigger agricultural companies, including meat, seafood, dairy, all of these are investing in ethical and sustainable brands and growing their portfolios of plant-based sustainable products. Do you think this signifies a future for the trend of investments? Are they going to continue to broaden their portfolios? Are you going to continue to broaden your portfolio in that way? You were saying that you were considering potentially moving towards like fully plant-based, but what would be the tipping point? I guess that's a big question.
Yeah, where's the tipping point, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think there's a tipping point for my businesses on going from animal to completely plant, but I do think that when we think about sustainability of our nutritional values, right, as we think about each and every individual's needs, and we think about what we can bring to the table to meet those needs, right? We need to think about it in every single supply chain, every single path. I'm getting a phone call, and making sure that we approach it with a defiant but also a clear and concise approach. So what do I mean by that? I mean that when we look at ingredients that we're putting into alternate proteins in the plant-based space, do we really want to put methylcellulose in there? Does that make sense? And the only reason we do it when we sit around the lunch table and discuss it is really profitability. If I was running a large plant-based burger company right now, if I can increase the methylcellulose by 2% a year, I increase my profits. So we're putting fillers into things, and so what I really concern myself with is the ethics of that approach of profitability. We're continuing to do exactly what we did after World War II, which is take profitability and put it into our nutritional path, and in doing that, we're disturbing our bodies and we're not bringing the best to bear for each and every one of us. So we have to really paradigm shift it. Do I think, from a financial standpoint, do I think that there's going to continue to be large food companies that are going to invest in that space? I think they have to. I think that they bear the burden of the responsibility for where they've taken us and where they have to go. Philip Morris's CEO takes cigarettes into it, Richmond-based company, actually released a full-page ad last week in the Washington Post and the New York Times discussing the idea of, can we remove cigarettes? Well, that's exactly what the president and CEO of Tyson Foods needs to think about. It's exactly what the folks in the large food industry need to think about, is how they're going to change the impact of the environment to our nutritional impact and sustainability in society. So I do believe there's going to continue to be investment in both the private sector, the VC sector, and in big corp into the plant-based space, and not only the plant-based space, but also kind of fixing the supply chain on the animal-based space. So when we look at regenerative proteins, we're really regenerative on both sides is really where we need to go.
100%, I agree with that. Now, how do you feel about cell-based meat?
How do I feel about cell-based meats? That's a great question. That's a little curveball.
Yeah, sprinkle that in last minute there for you.
I think that there's a great deal of work that needs to be done in that space before we're going to have something that's really fantastic and delicious. But do I think they're going to get to delicious? Yes. And delicious is coming in all kinds of forms, and it's really exciting from an innovative space. But I don't think we're quite there, but we'll get there. And I think that I think the investments are in place to make that happen. So I've got a little company out of Israel that I think will probably be one of the first. So.
Oh, very nice. Which one? Is it Future Meats? No? Okay. Secret. We'll talk about that later, next year. Perfect. So that's a good segue into my question for Jonathan Netsky. Alternative proteins, and actually we'll skip ahead one question. I know your products are 100% whole food, plant-based, which is actually quite different from many of the traditional alternative proteins on the market. Like Benjamin was just saying, there's so many added fillers, there's so much junk in so many of these alternative proteins or alternative products. Why is it important to be able to explain this importance for investors when they're considering and investing in alternative proteins or alternative products?
Yeah, I can't say that everything we have is whole food, that's for sure. Especially, I'm gonna get an arm wrestling match with my colleague over here. But just to kind of segue off what you're talking about, it sounds like a platitude, but one thing we take seriously like you do is we really do consider the earth one of our key stakeholders. And it sounds like a really bold statement, but remember, we were founded by a pro surfer who has a natural attitude that cares about where our food is sourced, where it comes from. Ethical sourcing is important. On top of that, we are also very concerned about where we make our product. We are not made in an industrial zone. We're made in a very small area in central Oregon, which challenges us with various difficulties. And then on top of that, we're also concerned about the things that we do. I mean, from what the employees do, whether they're riding a bike to work or whether we're using the right kind of packaging to meet both the demands of making profit and, of course, saving the environment, because, you know, we have to worry about things like permeability and packaging, which is a problem, I'm sure, for everybody. But one thing that's really important is there's no doubt that this is a growing market. So none of us are here to go broke while we're saving the world. We all want to make a profit. And if you look at all the Gartner numbers, it looks like from this year, $7 billion for plant-based food is going to be $74 billion by 2027. So there is money in this, and greedy investors are paying attention to this, and they're going to invest. But one thing I want to do is give a plug to millennials right now. I mean, millennials are changing the way that we do things in the world, whether you like it or not. Whether you're on the left or the right side of political spectrums, they are changing things. My generation, my parents' generation, Gen X, the boomers, the greatest generation have failed us when it comes to environmental situations. I mean, I think that regardless of your political feelings, everyone can say that what we're doing now is simply not sustainable. We can all make that negative argument. How we're going to handle it in the future is different. And I think it's going to be forced by the market because tastes are changing. Let me give you an example. I was a consultant for a very large milk manufacturer that's no longer in business. They're bankrupt now. And there's a reason for that. That's because millennials were changing, and for the most part, they're not drinking milk that comes from cows. They're drinking it from alternative sources. Now, are there other environmental problems making things from almonds and things like that? Sure there are. But this is a generation that's going to supplant us very, very soon. And if we don't react quickly, and the numbers are already there, you're really not going to be in the right park, let alone, the right planet in terms of trying to support this effort. So I think for the most part, there's a natural occurrence that we have to react to. So it may sound like what we're doing is groundbreaking. We're really just catching the tails of the wave in terms of a changing market, and of course it's also happening around the rest of the world. So I don't know if that's a specific answer to your question, but what I'm trying to say is there's an inevitability here. There's always going to be meat. There's always going to be crap products that you're going to just chortle down like your Cheetos and everything else, right? It's always going to be around, but there's this big supplanted addition that's occurring, and that's what we need to be ready for. Whether you're a craft or whether you're a small company like Laird, if you're not really situated to be prepared for that, I think you're in trouble.
I agree with that. Thank you. And Jonathan Netsky, what do you think? Also, you're in the alternative protein space, and you make 100% whole food plant-based proteins as well. Tell us about that.
You know, this is a question I guess I think I spoke to a little bit, is the reality that the primary reason for whole food, and agreeing with Benjamin, that it's not as important whether it's a plant or an animal if it's a whole food, because you haven't added all of the extra things, you haven't created all the byproducts, and there are opportunities, of course, within the animal system to do great sequestration of carbon or to get a good water profile. But when it comes to the creation of new products that we're putting into the marketplace, we fundamentally have to figure out, how do we start at the beginning? I'm not going to go create a market for something that I don't have a path towards producing in a sustainable fashion. And therefore, per the data that I shared with you guys this morning, we start with whole foods. And in my case, we start with whole food plant-based, because we see that as a much easier path and an opportunity where the doors are wide open, because I don't know if anybody else knows of a product that exclusively in the plant-based space is 100% made out of whole foods and is available in the commercial markets. And so by doing that, we're actually saying that as we grow, as long as we continue to operate under these same principles which we've designed for and scale up with multiple micro-batching as opposed to going from micro-batching to mass production, our sustainability quotient is actually baked in and in a position for us to continuously be improving it. And so for us, that's really the premise to whole food, is that it gives us a modus to be able to go forward and focus on that goal of creating a carbon neutral set of products that participate in what we hope will be a carbon neutral food system.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's great. It's really important to take into account the whole system. And again, going back to what I was saying in the beginning, it's not just about, what you're putting in the food, it's about the sustainability of everything around that whole life cycle. And it's about how you treat your employees. Everything else goes into that. That's all part of the same system. So beautiful. Moving forward, my next question is to Jonathan Leahy. Your company offers a variety of plant-based products, as you mentioned, consumable, health, wellness products. We talked about investing in health and wellness. How is it important that your company, as a plant-based, health-focused company, how important is it that it's a publicly traded company? What statement does that make?
Well, it goes back to my initial comments that, it is a milestone moment that we were able to go public so quickly. I think that is a real indicator that investors were very interested in us. So, starting 4 years ago and going to an IPO in 4 years is pretty daunting, and we were able to do it because we had a lot of support. If I could just comment about one more thing I want to mention that may seem like a non sequitur here. There's been a lot of talk on this panel about plant and meat-based products, but another thing, if you're interested and your company's interested in thinking about how more sustainable, responsible, plant-based opportunities might be, one thing that we're heavily involved in is confectionery. So don't forget that you can look at an alternative not just to meat, not just to things that are over-processed. You're also talking about another market that's amazingly large, multi-billion-dollar market, which is snack foods. And snack foods, for the most part, are completely garbage. I mean, they have clogged my arteries for decades and decades. And now you can move away from that. There's a huge opportunity in confectionery where you're not going to sacrifice flavor or tradition by moving into this space. Now, back to your question. It's a milestone because, first of all, I said we're catching a wave, so we're already kind of catching up to the milestone. But in terms of companies like ours that can be relatively small and can expand rapidly, that's where the opportunity is. So, you can take a company that had 4 people that now has 200 people in 4 years and went to a big market cap overnight. And I think that is showing that there's an absolute trend here. So I don't know if it's a milestone moment for our company, but I think that, we're kind of on the cusp of history about what's going to happen in the future with food.
I agree. It's not just a fringe movement, like we were saying earlier. It's not just hippies eating, granola, and it's people that are investing in more sustainable food products because it's not just important for their health. Layered superfood is great and has a lot of health-driven products, but it's also great for the environment. There's a lot of factors that tie into that. And we've seen all of these companies over the last couple of years, such as Oatly and Beyond Meat, going public. And it, again, just signifies a change in the market. I was just reading about Just Egg as well, that is potentially on the way to an IPO. And it's gaining force, and it's not going to go anywhere. And we've talked a lot about alternative proteins, but there's many different facets of the industry as well, like cell-based meat and cultured meat, fermented foods that are also offering alternatives to traditional products and to just create more sustainable systems. So.
Can I just jump in and ask a question? Because obviously we have some very good experts here. Last night I was having dinner with a billionaire tech investor, and I kind of asked him, we're talking on this topic, what do you think about, or what have you heard? And he mentioned vertical farming, and that was something that was completely new to me. But the way I look at food, like I don't care if it has an organic stamp. I care about if it's close to me in proximity. I want to find the carrots that are grown as close to my restaurants as possible, because that's how I grew up in Sweden, and it's important to me. So then when he started talking about vertical farming, and for those who don't know, like me yesterday, is basically these high rises in the middle of big cities where they grow under perfect condition, basically lettuce, carrots, and all kinds of products. What do you guys think about that space?
Well, it's expensive. There would be an investment there. Maybe you have alternatives. I'm probably the wrong person to answer this question because our particular level of product, most of it is sourced. It only grows in a certain region of the world. So we have to source a lot of our coconut-based products from Southeast Asia. So we're dependent upon that because if you're going to go to where the product is the best and where it's grown the best and where it's been, for eons and eons, we can't be close to that piece of it. However, within that environment, that's where we're very careful about ethical investment. We are very, very careful about sourcing because there are a lot of problems when you source from overseas. We don't have any direct control. So we send envoys, and we're careful that, the local farmers involved and that the workers are being treated and there's no animal cruelty. We have to worry about those things in our industry. So it's not a direct answer to your question, so I'll take myself out of that one and I'll pass it on to these two.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very familiar with concepts of aquaponics, hydroponics, vertical farming, and so forth, and have been trained in aquaponics by the USDA. And the realities of vertical farming is a beautiful thing, right? What you're doing is you're localizing the food supply. Now, is it practical in the sense that you described it to feed a manufacturing environment? Not in a residential way, but there are some buildings in the world that have incredible vertical farms. Some of them are on the balconies, some are on the interior of the building, like an atrium, to take advantage of that food source. Are the guys from Aero here? I thought there was a vertical farming company that was coming to the show, no? There are some other units that are both designed for you to utilize in your residential space, and there are some incredible opportunities where people have containerized vertical farming to put it right at the grocery store. So your greens could be coming from a container outside the back door, and yes, sometimes indoors produce is a little more mamsy-pamsy than the rugged outdoor stuff, but it can be incredibly nutritious. It can have a great shelf life, and it can be so ultimately fresh that you might even still get it with the roots on it in a lot of those grocers. So vertical farming, as I'm in a small town. I keep doing that. I'm in a small town in Flagstaff, and while they're creating a lot of density in our downtown area by creating some larger buildings and growing them up, it's kind of the same thing. That's taking away some of the gorgeous views of the mountains we have from downtown, but we're actually getting a vibrant downtown because of the density of the economics that are viable there. And the same thing happens with vertical farming to bring it into your shop.
I was asked by General Petraeus, who's actually an advisor to KKR, one of the largest investment companies in the world, that question probably June of last year. And it was really the fear of COVID that brought the idea of maybe they really should go hard and strong in a sustainable economic model into vertical farming. And they're making some investments in that path, so is Apollo. I think the real challenge is that it's easy to envision a holistic kind of a utopia as it relates to that, but you can't put everything into that model, right? It's not going to work. So I think you have to take a real practical sense of what works in that model, what doesn't. And then also, does that work in Cambridge City, Indiana? Probably not. Does it work in the middle of, Lake Charles, Louisiana? Probably not. But does it work in LA? And does it work in Chicago and New York? Does it create a model that's profitable in those markets? Probably it does. And then from there, we can microcosm it into the other markets around the country. It's very similar to kind of what's happening with ghost kitchens. And if you think about what's happening with the ghost kitchen market, you think about the folks that are down in Miami that are really building quite the platform on Zuckerberg's back. When you think about the ability to move food fast and quick to the consumer, think about that and drive it all the way back to the farm, and you really have quite an interesting model. So I think that when I look at the paradigm shift, that paradigm shift of really seeing vertical farming as probably a 2025, 2030 model where it really can be seen in major metropolitan areas, and you can see it impact us, right? Not just an investment.
Okay, and then I have one more question for me that I'm a little interested in. So I've seen some graphs where basically we know that the carbon footprint that eating a lot of meat creates, especially in the United States, that are basically the big bandits in this field. But there's a trend, there's a graph that's very clear that the Indian culture as well as Asian cultures are starting to eat more meat and chicken, etc. And what are we doing to kind of flatten that or fix that problem? Because that's basically not sustainable at all.
I guess that's mine, huh? So
Get some of those calls.
yeah. So when you look at let's just take beef coming out of Australia, largest grass-fed farms in the world. I was actually on one right before COVID. It was about 1 million acres. It was regenerative. Literally, the cattle would process themselves over about a 36-month period, which in the United States is 14 to 18 months, right? And because they're going onto a feedlot, and they would literally walk a 1 million acre farm, and by the time they got done with their walk, they were ready to be processed, okay? It was kind of a beautiful thing. But to your question, what's happening, and we're seeing it here in what we call inflation, but what's happening is those head are being processed, and that those pounds are being shipped into Asia and into the Indian markets. And so there's a sucking sound coming out of Asia that's changing our economics as it relates to red meat. Part of that's negative if you're looking at McDonald's, and McDonald's price to make a burger went up by about 22 cents in the last year, okay, on just the raw material cost. But forget McDonald's for a second. What's really happening is a shift both globally but also domestically. So we're seeing repurposing of farms in the United States because people want grass-fed beef. People want things that are healthier for them. And so you're starting to see, as Australia can't process and provide that global demand, right? We're starting to create the demand locally. And so I think you'll see us, you look back at Mexico, was importing wheat at the beginning of World War II, and now they're a huge exporter of wheat, right? I think we're going to see a shift, and the shift needs to just be healthier, right? Our message needs to be, we want a healthier, regenerative approach to growing not only our cattle, but our chicken and our pork. I was at Purdue's headquarters last Tuesday, meeting with their executive staff, and they've put obstacle courses inside their chicken houses, right? Which makes a heck of a lot more sense to me than when they first did free range and they opened the doors to the chicken house and said, yeah, you can walk outside, but the feed was in the house, so the chickens weren't leaving, right? So I think we're getting smarter step by step, and I think the left and the right sides of the political spectrum are starting to push against each other, and we're starting to get some right friction. What I really think matters at the end of the day is, does that friction create the right outcome? And are we talking about it not just for the sake of profits, because the profits exist. Humans want to eat, humans want to enjoy, they want things that are delicious, they want things that are nutritious. So the demand is there, right? It's speaking to the demand in the way that is healthy, right? And not only healthy for your consumption, but healthy for your mind and your spirit and all those things that matter in life.
Thank you. Sorry for kidnapping.
If I can add
please.
one question onto that, actually, to your expertise, it's on this specific subject of grass-fed meat. What is on a mass scale, I've eaten grass-fed meat most of my life. I've got most of my products from, by the quarter or otherwise. And it's a very, very different product, right?
Very different.
And so while we can acknowledge as a consumer who's never tasted it, I want grass-fed meat, when they get it on their plate, maybe it's a skirt steak that all of a sudden used to be so tender and fatty, and now it's chewy, like jerky potentially, or the flavor has what I consider to be the real flavor of beef, but it's off-putting to some people. Do you have a comment or experience on that? How do people make that shift if it's not what they expect?
Yeah, I was once hired by the largest grass-fed producer in the world to kind of we basically took every cut of the cattle and looked at it and compared it to what we're used to in the United States, which is product coming off the feedlot. And to your point, it was interesting to use like a skirt steak or a bovette or one of these particular cuts. Right. The iron that's in grass-fed beef tastes very different to us, right? And so we're not used to it. So there's a transition that occurs, but not in every cut is that the case. And what really needs to be measured, and maybe a little scientific, is the pH level of that cattle. So if we design the actual feeding structure back to the regenerative farm in such a way that the pH level at the processing plant is a little bit different, you're not going to have as many negative responses to the product. So it really is, how do we raise them on the farm? And that means, what grass are they eating? And if that pH level is such that that it's just a little higher in content, which you can get if you go to Butcher Box right now and you order grass-fed beef from Butcher Box, which is all they provide. Every one of their cattle is tested to meet that pH level, so that your interpretation of it when you consume it is such that it's not offensive, Okay, so that there's methods, they just have to be driven all the way back into the system so that we're successful in creating the transition, right?
And do you think those types of methods can come all the way back? And the reason I ask that question is just to make sure everyone aware, is everyone aware what the number one plant that we can grow that sequesters carbon is? It's the stuff that our cows eat. It's the grass, especially the tall grasses, right? That's where we can sequester the most. So that's the relevance to the question.
So I think there's two things. Yeah, I think that we can get the grass right, which is a big part of it. And I also think that, if we're going to talk environment, there's a methane gas release that's occurring from those cattle. And I've talked to the three major folks that are actually growing seaweed, and seaweed is going to be an alternative that we're going to start to feed cattle to reduce the methane almost to zero. So there are a lot of really kind of, I even like to use the word sexy things that are happening in the cattle industry. The linchpin's going to be, or the tipping point's going to be, when does the consumer demand recognize it, right? When do we recognize that methane gas is a problem to the environment, and I'm going to make a decision that when I go to Kroger, I'm going to buy something that's not only grass-fed, but it's methane carbon zero, right? That transition hasn't quite got there. The processor doesn't quite see it yet, and it's interesting. It has a lot to do with getting the consumer to recognize it. Just getting the consumer to understand that it's a need.
Yeah, and it does. And to the cell-based question that came up as well, I think that this goes in circles. But if people are going to be maintaining an appetite for meat from the incredible amount of marketing funds that have gone into attempting to educate people through what are now imitation meats, to me it seems like cell-based is kind of going to eat all of their lunch, because it seems odd that we took deep fryers out of a lot of places, but now we're making foods out of fat exclusively. It just seems really odd to me. So if cell-based meats are going to happen, and I believe they very much so are, and in the next few years, I think that there's an enormous market for that beyond what we're seeing today in some of the imitations in between. And the education that Benjamin's referring to is going to be critical for people to really be making their decisions once the meat cell-based looks exactly like the meat that might be grass-fed, at least in a ground form. Are we going to really know the differences and which ones we want to put our own dollars behind?
Hey, Jennifer, I have a question that could lob a whole grenade into this discussion.
Oh boy, here we go.
Go for it.
So, besides doing neat things like teaching cows how to eat like fish, how much is really going to be dependent upon getting industrial food? Because I've been to Tyson's and Purdue's and places like that before. How much is going to be dependent on getting them to change with regulatory compliance? Because I don't see these leviathans changing without paying off loads and loads and loads of lobbyists to fight things. I mean, independently, our companies can do novel things. There is an independent market for this, there's no doubt about it. But if we're talking about trillions of dollars and getting real impact on the planet, I don't know what your opinion is, but it sounds to me like you need some regulatory intervention. How do you feel about that?
This is a great question. I think that when we look at the last 5 years of politics, and I don't want to go too deep into it, but I could, and I should probably. But the reality is that we're a really divided nation, and we're a divided nation not only politically, but we're a divided nation when we start to discriminate against, is it supposed to be alternate plant-based, is it supposed to be alternate animal-based, and where are we going? But that division also is occurring when we talk about producing sustainable foods, and I'll use some of the large meat processors as an example. They know that they're bastardizing those proteins when they put 30% moisture in it and hold that moisture with phosphate so they can cook the product. But that's how they've made their money for decades. When you sit around that table, those same folks are proud that they've actually got an extra couple percent into that protein, right? So how do we change that? One part of it's education. You're right, we're all in a kind of a novel area of interest. But I also think that when we start to talk about the health impact that these foods can have on people, then we find the linchpin. Then we find the thing that makes things move. So, for instance, almost all of our products that we produce are sous vide. It sounds like a sexy French name. It is. But when you bring it down to its scientific level, it's 4 times the nutritional value for the exact same amount of ounces of protein. So when we start to make that the thing that a hospital wants, that a senior living facility wants, that a millennial wants, and we start to come in, then we'll see significant change. I've sat across the table from many people in that industry. I've had the pleasure of knowing most of the executives in the food industry, specifically in the plant-based industry. And I think that they know what's coming. They don't want to take the billions of dollars of assets that have been allocated in CapEx to process the way they process today and change until they're forced to, right? And it's billions, and in some cases, hundreds of billions that they've put into the process, and they're not going to change that until they start to realize that they're losing market share significantly.
Well, and I think back to what Jonathan was saying is, how do we have the conversation on a more like foundational and government level where we can make that something that they need to do, because it's something that needs to happen in order for our food systems to be sustainable. And I'm not saying that everybody should go vegan tomorrow. That's obviously an unrealistic expectation of the world. But how do we create those bridges for not only just consumers but for these companies to do that in a more in a more regulated way? I think was what you were saying, and I think that that's really important that we take steps towards that. So, moving forward, does anybody have anything else they want to talk about for that? Because I feel like we could talk about that for a very long time.
I think government's going to have to get involved, but when
I agree.
And how?
Right.
And I think if we move in one path in the next 10, 12 years in the United States, we'll go one way. And if we decide that there's 18 to 22% of the population needs us to go another way, we'll be delayed again. We left the Paris Accord.
And it even becomes more complicated when we look at the realities of, let's say we were going to do this on some type of carbon accounting method that you were going to actually be accountable for. Right. Well, what is that method? What's the standard? What are the rules? I presented you all with a lot of numbers this morning. Those numbers were purely based on the 2 other studies and following the same methodology they did, such that we had comparative accuracy. But can I tell you that those carbon numbers are truly accurate? We don't actually have a great standard out there that is being used across the board.
I agree. Yes, and well, I think there's really no standards, but there's also, like you were saying, Benjamin, there's a lack of awareness, and education around these impacts needs to really be championed, which is why I wanted to have this conversation today. And so I know we're getting a little bit short on time, so I wanted to wrap it up a little bit here and bring the question around to Alex, as he's in a different section of the industry than we are. Alex.
You got a question in the back, too.
We'll get to the questions in just a minute. I just wanted to ask Alex a little bit more about the restaurant industry really fast. The restaurant industry is also a portion of this, and bringing awareness into what people are consuming on a more day-to-day basis if they're not cooking at home. How can restaurants contribute and invest ethically in the future of food?
That is a great question. I think ultimately, basically people are the one making the decisions on where the restaurant industry is going to go. So when consumer demand changes, we have to adapt, because ultimately we can put half our menu as your fancy specialty products, and if it doesn't sell and everyone still orders the filet every night, it's not going to work. So I think that's a bigger picture effort for it to actually change. And we were very early with Beyond Beef at Flights and had actually pretty good success with it. I was surprised in the beginning, and then it's just been kind of getting stronger and stronger, that demand. So I think it's going to come for sure. One thing that I want to just point out as we're talking about restaurants, when we went in through when the pandemic started, it was very interesting to me how different the supply chains are. Basically, you could not find a single thing in the grocery stores. Like chicken was out, toilet paper was out. I mean, we all experienced it. I think you have a lot of toilet paper at home, and probably you too. Still, people were hoarding these products, and literally supply disappeared. And then you go to the restaurant side, where the Cisco's of the world, they had so much product that they had to throw a lot of it away. So we did a pretty creative solution. We turned one of our restaurants into a grocery store, a drive-through grocery store. It was featured in the Forbes It's pretty neat. We did almost $1 million in 6 weeks, having people drive through a parking lot, McDonald's style. I want toilet paper, I want chicken, I want butter, and then we placed it in their trunks without touching, and we kind of created work for all our employees. And going back to like sustainability, there's a lot of different ways to reach sustainability, and in this case, for me, it was, how do I get my employees to survive this? Because there's I mean, I think everyone knows in restaurants you have a lot of Hispanic people, for example, that are outside of the safety net. So when the pandemic started and they promised all these great extra unemployment bonuses, it just did not exist for a lot of people. They could not even go there. And we came up with some creative ways to basically make them sustainable for their families, and I'm really proud of that. And I think you all should come check out my restaurant while you're here.
Definitely. The restaurant industry was so hard hit during the pandemic. It was really crazy. As somebody who originally started my career in restaurants before I transitioned into consulting and entrepreneurship, watching the restaurant industry struggle was no joke. It was painful. And to see people like yourself who turned that into a positive situation in the way that they could, it's really great to hear that. And again, creating options, taking care of your employees, and just doing that the right way is really crucial to building the future of food. So, beautiful. And I believe with that, we are out of time. I wanted to make sure, do we have time for questions still? I'd love to hear what the audience thinks about everything. Again, I think this is a really important topic, so happy to be here with all of you chatting about this today and just bringing a more educated view to everything in food investment. Questions?
Yes, when you all are talking about the need to move to more sustainable farming and government regulation being the driver of that, I would argue that you need to follow the money. In other words, Goldman Sachs, BlackRock, JP Morgan, Chase, the big banks have all stated that if you don't have recognizable and reputable ESG programs in place, you're going to pay a penalty in terms of getting money from us. And I think that's going to be one of the key drivers as we go forward to create the change at Tyson, to create the change at some of these other companies, because the money's going to speak.
I agree with that. I just think, how do you get, again, more than just one or two of these businesses on board with supporting that? That's kind of the hard thing. If we had more government regulations around that, I think it would be helpful, at least to a certain degree, because we've already assessed the situation and understand that a change needs to be made. And yet we are, still not taking steps towards it in terms of regulation, which doesn't really help to facilitate the cause. But that's my thoughts on it. I think that that's definitely an important thing as well, but it still should be government enforced. Gentlemen?
I think that covers it. Yeah. I agree with your statement. It wasn't really a question. I think it's a good statement. So.
Yeah, I mean, the markets definitely demand what they demand.
Yep.
And that's just a reality. I don't know that more regulation, to his point, is actually beneficial. I know that in the food system, it's both over-regulated and under-regulated.
I agree
in other
with
words, having done a lot of work with meat processors and interviewed many of them over the years for in a previous life, the number one reason for a meat processor to go out of business from our study was the change of their inspector. Their inspector changed, and because the person changed, the rules changed. That was mind-boggling to me. And so that was a byproduct of what I would consider to be some certain levels of regulation that weren't in place properly. And as well, in the local food systems, I'm in a lot of restaurants, and I walk in the back door. And I don't walk in with a logo on because they'll kick me right out, right? But I walk in the back door to meet people, to talk to people, to sell food, and I do a lot less eating out by having been in so many kitchens. So there are realities to whether or not regulations really make that big a difference, or if the markets are going to force them themselves. And so I can't give an answer to it, but I do see both sides pretty clearly.
Yeah, but so the gentleman questioner, I think he makes a good point. I mean, you say the market demands what the market demands. The market used to demand cigarettes and thalidomide. doesn't demand that anymore. So I think to your point, I think maybe the argument we're really having is the rapidity, how fast this can happen. And I think that's probably the frustration here is some of us want it to happen overnight, and it's just not going to be that way. So yeah, I think we're making our best effort. So.
Great.
Thank you.
Any other questions? I can sort of see you in the back there. These lights are so bright. It's great.
So I'm a young man, 22, and I just graduated from business school. And through doing the work that we do, I started to meet farmers and the actual farmer themselves. I think that they have a lot more power than they think they do. And so my question for you guys is, do you think that if given a better choice and with higher levels of education, do you think that the change can actually start with the farmer?
I think that's an interesting question. I think the change starts with the market, and the market drives the change to the farmer. And the farmer has a series of options about exactly how they want to play their cards as it relates to the available markets, right? So it's not one way or the other, but I do think that the farmer has the option to make the right decisions that make them more applicable to what the future demand will be, right? And if they're speaking the right path, if they're building the right path, because that's the hard work that farmers got to take and essentially mentor that land and mentor their animals and mentor the people that work on that farm so that what they make available, not today, but months, if not years later, are what the market wants, right? But there's a yin and yang there. It's not one way or the other. And most farmers, to be honest, at the end of the day, are not the best people to go to market. It's kind of like doctors aren't great business people. Farmers are great business people, but they're not great marketers in most cases. There's a few exceptions to that. And when that happens, they usually build great businesses because they have their yin and yang works, right? So I don't think that you could be the best farmer in the world, but if you don't understand the markets and you don't understand how to produce for those markets, you're not going to be incredibly successful. You might be successful on your farm. You're not going to be successful in the outer world. So, and grow your market. So, it's interesting when we think about what made some of the largest meat processors who they are today. It was the unique, innovative things that they did 60 years ago, like flying chickens from Arkansas to Chicago, that gave them a brand that created an awareness. That's not your normal farmer, right? So let's be honest about what the local farmer can do and how it can transition things. Now, it works extremely well if that farmer can have the ability to communicate with the local farmer's market or the local restaurant chain and be able to build its local fiefdom. But it's challenging, right? Because it's not the normal makeup of that type of personality.
Or the farmer could just take a stand and start growing hemp like everybody else.
Yeah, right. Grow weed. Good idea.
That is definitely a profitable industry, I agree. Yeah, I think that education and also resources play a big part too in what options the farmers have and how they're presenting and how they're taking care of their products. We're talking about, animal farming. So that's just something to keep in mind as well. That's not always accessible to smaller farmers, and that can mean, resources for marketing and things of that nature as well. So.
Well, and there's nothing wrong with the aspiration to be a small farmer that supports his region or her region and doesn't have national aspirations or need a massive marketing plan because there's so much desire for the quality of the foods that they produce locally. So, from that perspective, I think there could be a microcosm that your question really fits into perfectly, as the answer would be yes. But to Benjamin's point, there's, in a much bigger picture or in a variety of different pictures, it might not be as easy of a yes.
If you're feeding the microcosm or you're feeding the world, you're feeding part of the world in that microcosm. So it's a complicated little puzzle.
Yes.
All right. And on that note, thank you all so much, everybody. I know we're a little bit over time.
Thanks a lot.